The border town of Larkspur Crossing sat like a scab between two nations, between two languages, two church bells, two sets of laws written by men who never had to eat their own punishments. The railroad ran through the valley like a blade pulled slowly from a sheath, promising passage and meaning, but mostly bringing new uniforms and fresh reasons to hate. Dust lived on everything. Even the wind carried grit, as if the land itself wanted proof that it had been wronged. Elias had come to Larkspur Crossing with a pack mule, a notebook of phrases, and a talent that got him paid in small coins and larger favors. He told people he was an interpreter, a man of words, a translator between sides. But he had learned the deeper truth. Translation was never just about language. It was about choosing which threat to soften and which wound to name. It was about deciding which truth would keep somebody alive for one more day. He lived above a cramped feed and saddlery shop run by a widow who pretended her loneliness was good business. Elias slept on a narrow cot and woke early to practice sounds he could almost feel in his teeth. In the morning, he stood on the plank walkway outside and watched the street like it might tell him what kind of trouble was coming. Hattie worked in the telegraph office. Her hands moved with a speed born from necessity, wiring, clipping, winding, stamping messages into place. Folks said her fingers were steady because she had learned too long ago that shaking got you killed or ruined. She had the kind of face that made people want to look away quickly, as if they'd seen something they weren't entitled to. She had arrived in town years before, when Larkspur still felt like a promise rather than a trap. Elias remembered the first time he saw her. She was leaning over a sack of flour, counting it with a careful math that didn't match the rest of her hurried movements. She looked up when he approached and offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elias tried to be the kind of man who could make politeness into safety. He offered her help once, just carrying a coil of line rope from the supply shed. She accepted without gratitude and without refusal. It was a way of saying she'd learned both ways could be dangerous. The day the trouble turned, it began as a rumor draped in fear. A party of settlers had arrived from the east side of the river, claiming that a group of travelers, indigenous travelers, had stolen horses. They were not wrong about the horses being gone. They were wrong about why. The town had grown used to lies the way a body grows used to scars, assuming the pain meant permanence. Elias had been summoned to the council room under the excuse of proper translation. He knew better. They didn't want proper translation. They wanted a verdict shaped like their own anger. When Elias stepped into the room, he saw Marrow waiting by the wall. Marrow was not from the same band as the men Elias had met in his early months. Still, Elias recognized the unhurried gaze of someone used to watching for betrayal. Marrow's hands stayed loose at his sides, a posture that promised he would fight only if he had no other option. Marrow looked at Elias with something like patience, but his eyes had a hard edge, melancholy wrapped around discipline. Elias had first met him during a winter raid that ended with bodies and broken promises. Elias had translated a frantic exchange between Marrow's people and a handful of terrified settlers. He'd told himself he was helping. Afterwards, the settler captain had thanked him with a bottle of whiskey and a warning. "Choose your loyalties, boy. The line isn't where you think it is." Now, in that council room, the warning returned. Hattie stood at a rear door, listening with the kind of attention telegraph operators reserved for quiet signals. She wasn't supposed to be there. Women were rarely supposed to witness decisions in rooms like that. But she had found a way in. Elias didn't know then whether it was bravery or simply that she refused to let others hold her life at a distance. The men around the table spoke about criminals and savage theft and law. Every word was shaped like a rope ready to tighten. Elias listened, then waited until the council president, a broad-shouldered man with a wedding ring he kept polished like a talisman, finished his speech. "Let's hear what the other side says," the president snapped. Marrow answered in his own language, measured and quiet. Elias translated. He chose words that carried meaning instead of smoke. Marrow's people had taken horses because the winter stores were low and the river crossings were unsafe. A promise had been made earlier, quietly, not in council. Some horses would be returned once the hunting season turned, and the band could move without risking children. The settlers, however, had not treated promises as binding. Their men had shot at travelers who had offered what they called trade, though it was mostly desperation. As Elias spoke, the room's anger shifted. It looked for a place to land. The president leaned forward, eyes bright with certainty. "So you admit it. You admit they stole." Elias swallowed. He knew what the president wanted, a confession that could be carved into law. Elias could provide it by stretching truth, but he'd seen enough death to know that stretching truth was a kind of murder. Marrow's gaze didn't move. He didn't plead. That made it worse. He spoke again, and Elias translated what Marrow insisted upon. No theft without justification. No harm without cause. No peace without accountability. The president struck the table with his fist. Accountability means surrender. That was the moment Elias felt the room decide the outcome without asking the people inside it. Hattie stepped forward then, as if she'd been called by the shape of injustice itself. Elias hadn't told her about the council meeting. He also hadn't told her anything he thought she couldn't use. But she looked at the president and spoke with a sharp clarity that surprised even her. "If you send men to collect surrender, you'll send them into ambush," she said. Her voice carried in the room like a bell rung in a church that had been built for lies. "And you'll blame the wrong bodies. I'm not guessing. I've read the dispatches." The president frowned. "You don't have authority here." "No," Hattie agreed, "but I have the wires." Elias watched the council's faces harden. Authority in that town meant men who could claim ownership over facts. Hattie didn't claim ownership. She carried the truth through thin strands of wire and kept it from burning up. They dismissed the council quickly after that. Elias was ordered to translate further negotiations. Marrow was told he would be held until the horses were returned. Elias heard the order like a sentence. When Marrow left the room, he paused by Hattie's position. Elias saw it then. Hattie's attention wasn't only on danger. It was on Marrow, and something in her expression softened, just a fraction, before she smothered it again. Elias caught his breath. He didn't know what he was watching at first. He only knew the feeling of it, the recognition that people were not supposed to look at each other with tenderness when the world demanded sharpness. Outside, the afternoon sunlight was so bright it seemed cruel. Elias walked the dusty main street with his notebook tucked under his arm. He had errands, messages to deliver, phrases to revise, but the air around him felt thick, like a storm had already started on the far side of the clouds. Hattie found him near the telegraph office. She didn't call his name. She just stood with her back against the wood slats of the building, as if she'd been there long enough for the wood to learn her shape. "Do you think you can fix it?" she asked. Elias glanced at her hands. The burn mark near her thumb was paler than he remembered, but it still looked like a scar that refused to fade. "I don't know," Elias admitted. "Fixing it means changing what people want." "That's a hard kind of work," Hattie said. Her words might have sounded like sympathy if she didn't phrase them like a warning. Elias leaned closer. "Why are you here? Why do you care what happens to his people?" It should have been a question of facts. Instead, it became a question of choice. Hattie's mouth tightened. "Because I've lived long enough to know that borders don't just cut land. They cut families. They cut the words you can say without getting your tongue punished." Elias studied her face for lies and found none he could use. A whistle sounded down the street, too sharp to be harmless. Men were moving with intent. The town was already assembling itself for violence. Within an hour, gun smoke rose behind the warehouse row. The first screams were swallowed by distance, but the panic reached everyone anyway. Elias ran. He didn't run toward the loudest noise. He ran toward the direction where people might be trapped between choices. He found Hattie outside the telegraph office again, though she'd already shouldered her way through fear to the place where she could send information. A messenger boy handed her a strip of paper. An incoming dispatch, the kind of message that could prevent deaths or provoke them. Hattie read it once. Her eyes went flat. Elias grabbed her elbow. "What does it say?" She didn't answer with words. She pointed toward the river road. The dispatch described a detachment being ordered to recover property. The message included a time, a route, and the names of men who would act with full authority. Those names were local. Elias knew some of them. He also knew the kind of men they became when given permission. "They're going to bait a fight," Elias said. "They're going to use our translation as an excuse," Hattie replied, her voice still controlled. "If the first shot is indigenous, they'll call it proof. If it's settler, they'll call it treachery. Either way, they get what they want." Marrow arrived then, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided where he would die, if dying happened to be the only path left. He didn't look at the men running toward the river road. He looked at Elias and Hattie. "Come," Marrow said. Elias tried to understand the plan forming in Marrow's face. It was not grand. It was not heroic in the way posters promised heroism. It was survival stitched with ethics. Hattie hesitated. "They'll kill you if you come closer." "They already want to kill me," Marrow said. "I will not let them kill Elias for telling them the truth." Elias flinched. That wasn't what he expected. He'd always framed his translation as service. Marrow framed it as risk. Hattie looked at Elias too, and Elias saw in her expression a kind of anger that wasn't only directed at the men with guns. "You keep thinking you can do right by words," she told him. "But the town doesn't want words. It wants bodies." Elias opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He couldn't disagree. They moved together, three figures in the border town's chaos, weaving between wagons and men who pretended they didn't see. Elias carried his notebook like a charm he couldn't stop believing in. Hattie carried the telegraph dispatch folded in her pocket like contraband. Marrow carried nothing visible, but his presence held weight. They reached the edge of the town where the river road bent into a strip of cottonwoods. There the air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The gunfire had shifted to a different rhythm, as if somebody had finally stepped on the wrong board. A scout stumbled into view, breathing hard. He recognized Elias. "Interpreter!" he called, voice cracking. "They're saying you're with them! They're saying you—" He didn't finish. His eyes rolled as if his body had decided the sentence was too long. Elias crouched, hands moving before thought. He pressed his fingers to the scout's throat. The pulse was weak. Elias felt it fade under his thumb. The scout whispered something. Elias leaned in. He said it. The wires. The girl. Then the scout stopped speaking. Hattie made a sound that wasn't a scream, but a grief that tried to find shape. Elias looked up and saw movement in the trees. Shadowy men taking cover, aiming at a scene they'd already decided would be proof. Marrow stepped forward, placing himself between Elias and the shooter's angle. It was wrong to think of it as sacrifice. In Larkspur, everything that mattered got called wrong. A gun cracked. Elias heard the report and understood it wasn't directed at his head. Someone had missed or aimed low on purpose. Another shot followed, closer, spitting splinters from a nearby post. Marrow moved fast then, using the terrain like language. Elias and Hattie followed because staying put felt like inviting death to choose its time. They reached a shallow ditch. Elias shoved Hattie down instinctively. She fought him for half a heartbeat, then obeyed because she saw the truth in his eyes. A bullet tore through the air above them. Dirt rained in a small storm. When the firing paused, Elias could hear his own breathing. It sounded too loud. It sounded like a confession. Hattie pressed her palm to the ground. Her fingers trembled, and for a moment Elias watched her without seeing her face, only her hands and the burn mark near her thumb. "Do you know why they think you're with them?" Elias asked, trying to make his fear useful. Hattie didn't look at him. "Because I send messages, and because I don't belong to the men who decide what the messages mean." Elias frowned. "They could verify your dispatches." "They could," Hattie said, "but verifying takes time, and time is something men like that don't spend unless it benefits them." Marrow shifted beside them. In the dim light between trees, his eyes caught Elias's gaze. Marrow's expression was still controlled, but something in it said, "You see what you need to see. Now choose." Elias forced himself to focus. Their proximity in that ditch was forced by danger, but it wasn't accidental. Elias felt the closeness of Hattie's shoulder against his arm and realized he'd been thinking of her as only a coworker, only a woman in a building with wires. He realized he had never asked what those dispatches cost her. Hattie's breath was shallow. Elias could smell smoke and river mud and something faintly sweet, like an herb she carried or a candle she once made to pretend her life was normal. Marrow spoke softly in his language. Elias translated without thinking. Marrow believed the shooters were not from Marrow's people. They were from the town's militia, acting on a rumor meant to provoke a clash. Hattie's head snapped toward Marrow. "You know that?" Marrow nodded. "I know who wants the border to stay bloody." The next volley of gunfire came like a decision finalized. Elias realized they could not stay in that ditch forever. He stood first and immediately regretted it. Dirt exploded from a bullet striking the edge of the ditch. Elias dropped back down and grabbed Hattie's sleeve. Marrow touched Elias's notebook, lightly like a man touching a loaded gun. Elias felt the warning without words. Marrow pointed toward the low ground along the river where reeds grew thick. There was a path, narrow and hidden. Elias didn't like hidden paths. He liked daylight and honest language. But honest language had brought them here. Elias held his breath and helped Hattie move through the reeds. Marrow went first, stepping where the earth was softest. Elias followed, guiding Hattie around branches without breaking them. By the time they reached a hidden stand of stones, the sounds of gunfire had faded into a distant roar. Not ended, just relocated. They sat behind the stones, three bodies shaped by fear. The day had turned to late afternoon, and the sun's angle painted everything gold while the shadows kept secrets. Hattie's lips moved without speech. Elias asked, "What?" "Do you ever wonder," Hattie said, her voice barely a thread, "if the person who writes the law knows they're signing their own death warrant?" Elias stared at her. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but usually it's not their death." Hattie looked at Marrow. "You could leave. Get away from this town. Find another place to live." Marrow's expression tightened at the corners. Elias watched him fight the urge to smile at kindness he didn't trust. "I can leave," Marrow said. "But then what happens to Elias? What happens to you?" Elias felt the words like a hook. He didn't know how to answer. He only knew he didn't want to be a reason for someone else's suffering. Hattie's hand slid to Elias's wrist. The touch was brief, but grounding. Elias felt his own pulse under her fingers. "Elias," she said quietly. Hearing her say his name like that, soft, intimate, not professional, made his chest ache. He turned his head. "Yes?" Her gaze held his, and in it he saw not only fear, but a kind of longing she kept locked away behind duty. "I tried not to," Hattie said. Elias frowned. "Not to what?" Hattie swallowed. "Not to care." The honesty cracked something open in him. Elias had built his life on controlled decisions. Translate carefully, speak gently, choose words that might prevent violence. He had never built a life on choosing a person. He had assumed the town's cruelty would keep him safe from wanting. Now wanting stood right in front of him, breathless and dangerous. He leaned closer, close enough that his forehead almost touched hers. "Why now?" he asked. Hattie's eyes glistened. "Because the border finally showed me the truth. It doesn't just keep us apart, it tells us what to be ashamed of. It tells me I should be grateful for surviving, even if surviving means I never loved anyone back." Marrow looked away, giving them the space of privacy, an act that made Elias realize Marrow had already accepted grief as payment. From the stones, they watched the sun sink behind the cottonwoods. The river moved with slow persistence. Elias could hear town sounds in the distance. Shouts, a bell, someone praying too loudly. Eventually, a figure approached along the river path, one of the militia's men, alone. He carried a lantern despite the day ending. His fear made him waste fuel. He spotted Marrow first. His hand went to his belt. "Interpreter," he snarled at Elias. "You're hiding. I should have known." Elias stood carefully, hands open to show he carried no gun. "You have the wrong story," he said. The man's eyes flicked to Hattie. "She's the wire girl. I saw her sending messages." Hattie's jaw clenched. Elias watched the anger in her. It was the anger of someone who had been used as a tool, not thanked for a service. Marrow stepped slightly forward. "You came alone," he said. "You came to offer your own lie to the fire." The man hesitated, then raised his gun. Elias moved fast, too fast for thought. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted. The gun fired into the reeds, sending up sparks and leaves. The militiaman stumbled back, cursing. Elias felt pain bloom in his shoulder as the man struck him. Hattie screamed and threw herself between Elias and the gun's angle, grabbing at the barrel like she could wrestle a future out of metal. Marrow caught her shoulders and pulled her away at the last moment. The militiaman tried to scramble back. Marrow moved like a shadow, knocking the gun aside and pinning the man with knees and hands. The struggle lasted seconds and felt like an eternity. When it ended, Elias realized his hands were shaking, not from fear alone. It was the shock of seeing Hattie risk herself for him. Hattie stood breathing hard, eyes wide with tears she refused to let fall. Her chest rose and fell as if she had run miles. "Why?" Elias asked her, voice hoarse. "Why do that?" Hattie looked at him like the question was an insult to her bravery. Then her face crumpled slightly. "Because you keep trying to save everybody," she said. "And nobody saves you. Not the way you think you're saving them." Elias had no answer. The town's cruelty had taught him to accept loneliness as a price. Now Hattie had shown him loneliness could be chosen differently. Marrow tied the militiaman's wrists with a strip torn from his own sash. He didn't beat the man. He waited, and in waiting Elias understood Marrow's goal. Not revenge, but leverage. "If I hand him to the wrong people," Marrow said in his language, and Elias translated, "he dies by morning and the town writes a new lie. If I let him go, he returns to his captain and tells the truth the wrong way. So we wait for the captain to come himself." Hattie's eyes widened. "You want them here?" Marrow nodded. "I want the border to witness." Elias felt a chill. That was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that demanded an audience. A lantern bobbed farther down the river path. A voice called out. The militia captain arrived with 2 men behind him, boots splashing in shallow water. He looked furious enough to burn. He saw Marrow pinning his subordinate. "What is this?" he demanded. Elias stepped forward slowly. "This is what you get when you order men to provoke a clash. Your dispatches were intercepted." He held up the folded paper Hattie had pulled from her pocket earlier, the one with the time and route. The captain's expression twisted. "You—" The captain reached for his own authority, grabbing at Elias's role. "Interpreter, you've been tricked. These people—" Hattie cut in. "No, Elias hasn't been tricked. I read your message, and I read the responses. You're not protecting your country, you're protecting your pride." The captain stared at her as if she was the most offensive object in the world. "You're just a woman," he spat. Hattie's eyes flashed. "And you're just a coward with a badge." The air went brittle. The captain turned on Elias. "If you're so righteous, why haven't you stopped the theft? Why haven't you prevented the attack?" Elias wanted to scream that the attack had been planned. Instead, he chose a path that felt like walking a rope over a river. "Because you didn't want it prevented," Elias said. "You wanted an excuse. You wanted permission." The captain's jaw clenched. "Permission from whom?" Elias looked at Hattie, then at Marrow. He realized the truth would only land if it included consequences. He couldn't just expose the militia. He had to show the town what it had already paid. He spoke again. "From men who profit when borders bleed." from officials who get to call themselves protectors after the fact. Marrow's eyes never left the captain. "You came to recover property," Marrow said through Elias, "but you never asked whose property it was. You never asked who needed it. You only asked what would keep you in power." The captain hesitated, and the hesitation was the crack Elias needed. It wasn't mercy, it was opportunity. Elias signaled Hattie to move closer. She stepped up beside him, her shoulders squared, her face pale but determined. Elias didn't hold her hand. He didn't need to. Her presence was already a declaration. The captain's two men shifted their weight. They looked at each other, and Elias saw uncertainty. Uncertainty in men with guns was the start of change. Then, from the distance, a new sound carried. A drum beat. Not war drums, but the rhythmic steps of a patrol coming from the other side of the river. Two flags, two jurisdictions, both arriving too late to pretend innocence. The captain's posture changed. He realized this wasn't just a fight between individuals, it was a problem for governments. Hattie met Elias's eyes. In them, he saw what he'd missed before. She wasn't only brave when violence threatened, she was brave when rules became weapons. Marrow spoke in a low tone through Elias. "Tell them," he urged. "Tell them what you know." Elias's throat tightened. He wanted to protect people by staying quiet. Quiet had saved him before. Quiet had also allowed cruelty to become routine. He took a breath and stepped toward the patrol's approaching light. When the officers arrived, the river road turned into a courtroom made of mud and lanterns. Elias explained the dispatch, the stolen horses, the intended provocation, and the interception Hattie had performed through her telegraph connections. He did it with careful language but firm truth, letting the evidence speak and refusing to polish it into something convenient. The patrol officers from the other side listened differently than the local council had. Their eyes were colder. Their loyalty ran to their own flags, not to the town's traditions of vengeance. Elias realized then that the border town's tragedy came not only from cruelty, but from divided enforcement, how each side blamed the other and refused to clean up. Elias didn't fully trust the officers. He trusted facts. The militia captain was detained. His men were disarmed. The scout who had died remained buried under reeds, his last whisper swallowed by distance. Elias couldn't resurrect him with law, but law could prevent the next death. In the aftermath, the town's streets felt unfamiliar. Men still muttered. Women still drew curtains closed. Yet the edge of inevitability dulled slightly, as if the border had been forced to acknowledge itself. Marrow disappeared into the cottonwoods before morning. He didn't demand gratitude. He didn't linger for romance. He left like someone who believed love was a fire that deserved a controlled hearth, not a battlefield. Elias found Hattie the next day behind the telegraph office, where the river wind carried away smoke and left only damp earth. The sky was washed-out gray, the color of old paper. Hattie held her hands together like she was keeping herself from shaking. "They'll call you traitor," she said. Elias didn't deny it. "They might," he replied. "But if the town calls truth betrayal, then I'm already lost. I prefer losing honestly." Hattie huffed a quiet laugh with no humor. "You're going to ruin yourself." Elias leaned closer. "Maybe I was already ruined. I just didn't know it." Hattie's eyes softened. She reached out and brushed her fingertips against the scar on his face, the one he usually hid with his hair. Her touch was careful, reverent. It startled him. "I used to think love was a kind of theft," Hattie said, "something you stole from your own survival. But every day I kept living, I realized survival was never enough. It didn't even protect me." Elias swallowed. "What about Marrow?" Hattie's face shifted, melancholy deepening, not disappearing. "Marrow didn't ask for my love," she said. "He asked me for courage, and I gave it. That's not the same as wanting him." Elias's chest tightened. He hadn't realized how much that question mattered until she answered it. Then she said something that changed the angle of his understanding. "I wanted you," Hattie admitted, "not just as an interpreter, Not just as a man who speaks carefully. I wanted the part of you that knows when words aren't enough. I wanted the part of you that still tries anyway. Elias felt emotion rise like heat behind his ribs. He wanted to kiss her. He didn't because he'd learned that kisses without consent became more violence. Instead, he held her gaze and nodded. "Then I'll try with you," he said. Hattie closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they looked like a person making peace with pain. "I can't stay," she said. "Not in this town. Not after what I sent. They'll find a way to punish me." Elias's stomach turned. "Where would you go?" Hattie glanced toward the river road, toward the border that pretended it was only a line. "Where Marrow goes. Where the stories are older and the rules are different." Elias stared. "That would mean living with his people." Hattie nodded slowly. "It would mean learning new words for safety. It would mean paying for the life I chose." Elias thought of his notebook, his careful phrases. He thought of how translation had been his shield. If he went with her, he would have to become more than a translator. He would have to become a participant. He wasn't sure he deserved that risk. But love wasn't earned by merit. Love was earned by choosing when fear offered you excuses. "Then come with me tonight," Elias said, voice low. "Let's leave before the town decides what we are." Hattie exhaled, relief and sorrow tangled. "If we leave," she whispered, "we may never see this place again. The border town will become a ghost in our mouths." Elias nodded. "Ghosts can't hurt you." Hattie looked at him like she understood the metaphor was too simple. Still, she leaned in and rested her forehead against his for one brief moment. It was not a grand romantic gesture. It was a human one, warmth against cold. That evening they packed quickly. Hattie hid the telegraph key that matched her private access codes. Elias tucked his notebook into his coat. The mule they used was old and stubborn, but it carried them without complaint. They left through a side lane behind the feed store where the town's watch was less attentive. The night held no romance, only the cold honesty of survival. When they reached the cottonwoods near the river, Marrow was waiting. Elias saw him standing by a fire that looked too steady for the wind that stirred it. Marrow watched Elias and Hattie approach. He didn't ask why they came. He asked something else. "Do you understand what you're walking into?" Marrow asked through Elias's own understanding, because the question wasn't only for Elias, it was for both of them. Hattie answered first, her voice firm. "I understand the town will never love us back. I understand we'll be blamed for every piece that fails." Elias added, "I understand I can't translate my way out of consequences." Marrow's expression softened by a fraction. "Good," he said. Then he looked at Hattie specifically. "You have been carrying wires like a curse," he told her. "Now carry something else." Hattie's eyes shone in the firelight. "What?" Marrow leaned forward slightly. "Carry the knowledge that your voice mattered. You didn't just survive. You changed the story." Hattie swallowed hard, and Elias saw the grief in her. Grief for the people she couldn't save, for the men she'd lied to when truth wasn't safe yet, for the years she'd spent believing she was only useful when she was silent. Elias reached for her hand. She held it, not flinching this time. Marrow looked away, giving them space again. Respect was Marrow's strongest weapon. They stayed by the fire through the night, not as lovers performing intimacy for others to witness, but as people building a new kind of life slowly, like a quilt stitched from scraps. Hattie taught Elias the way she had hidden dispatch routes in plain sight, using the patterns of her work to smuggle truth through networks of lies. Elias taught Hattie how to speak with the right cadence in council meetings on the other side, how to make your words land without inviting punishment. But the deepest lesson was not about language. It was about trust. At dawn, a messenger arrived with urgent news. Another border clash was forming. Some officers on both sides were preparing to retaliate for the detained captain. There were rumors that Marrow's people would be targeted on the grounds of continued aggression. Marrow's face hardened. They want a second blood, he said. Elias's chest tightened. We can't let it happen, he replied. Hattie stared at the ground, then looked up. They will come for us because we survived, she said quietly. They will punish us as examples. Elias felt helpless rage. He had translated threats into words before. Now he understood that words weren't enough. People needed action. Marrow spoke slowly. Then we act with purpose, not with gunfire first, with proof. Elias blinked. Proof? Marrow nodded. The border has 2 cultures and 2 countries, but it also has ledgers. It has signatures. It has the evidence men swear by when it becomes inconvenient to pretend they don't know. Hattie's lips pressed together. You want me to send dispatches again? Marrow's gaze held hers. Not to hide, to expose, to make the next retaliation cost everyone's reputation. Elias realized the angle. Hattie's skill with the telegraph wasn't just a survival trick. It was a weapon against manufactured certainty. She could force officials to see what they had tried to erase. Hattie's eyes filled, but she didn't look afraid now. She looked resolved. I'll do it, she said, but I won't do it alone. Elias will stand beside me when the wires start burning. Elias nodded firmly. I'm not leaving you behind again, he promised. Marrow watched them, expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod, not approval, but acknowledgement of choice. They returned to Larkspur Crossing quietly, using knowledge of back roads and the cover of dawn. Elias kept his notebook ready. Hattie kept her telegraph access hidden. Marrow stayed with them, but not in front, like a boundary stone placed carefully where danger could be redirected. The town had not calmed. In fact, it had inflamed. Men spoke of revenge in taverns and on porches. Women listened and kept their faces neutral. The border town was a machine for turning fear into permission. They reached the telegraph office before the shift changed. Hattie's hands moved with old confidence. She didn't merely send a message, she sent a chain of truths. Names, times, intercepted dispatch content, statements from witnesses Elias had saved in his notebook, and accounts of how the militia had planned provocation. Elias translated as he recorded the outgoing text to ensure nothing shifted under stress. Marrow stood near the window, watching for the moment when someone would arrive to shut them down. They didn't wait long. A local official stormed in, furious that the other side patrol had detained the captain. He demanded the wire girl stop. He demanded Elias surrender his notebook. Hattie smiled without warmth. If you want my authority, she said, you'll have to earn it with honesty. The official's hand went for a pistol. Elias's voice sharpened. You don't want that shot. You'll make your own government look like liars. You'll be the spark in a room full of paper. The official hesitated. Elias spoke to the man's pride and his fear of exposure. People like him rarely feared consequences until consequences had a paper trail. Marrow stepped forward then, not brandishing a weapon, only presence. Your order was blood, Marrow said through Elias. Now face the ledger. Hattie hit the telegraph lever again to confirm transmission. The official lunged forward. Elias moved at the last second, grabbing the official's wrist and pinning it against the desk. Hattie's eyes went wide, not at the struggle, but at the closeness, at how the office, which had always felt like a place of controlled distance, now became a place of shared danger. A shot cracked outside. Someone else had heard. The building trembled with the violence the town refused to stop. Elias felt a hot flare across his side where a bullet grazed him, or where someone struck him with the butt of a rifle. Pain bloomed like an accusation. Still, he didn't release the official. He held firm until the official stopped fighting, until Marrow's people arrived on cue with hands open to show they carried no weapons intended for murder. Within minutes, riders appeared, officers from both sides, not as friends, but as representatives forced to act because of the messages now moving faster than rumor. The telegraph had turned the border's hidden machinery into a public record. The official who had tried to stop Hattie was arrested on the spot. Elias watched men who previously talked like prophets now search for loopholes. He watched the town's leaders realize they could no longer kill the story. It wasn't justice as clean as a preacher promised. It was justice as messy as a wound. People were still angry. People still wanted blood, but now blood had paperwork attached. Marrow didn't celebrate. Hattie didn't grin. Elias didn't weep. They only stood in the aftermath, listening to the town's breath return in shallow increments. That night, when the town settled into uneasy quiet, Elias went outside with Hattie. The stars looked sharp and indifferent. The river moved as if nothing important had ever happened. Hattie leaned against the telegraph office wall. Her hair had come loose from its braid, strands catching lantern light like a halo she refused to claim. "You're bleeding," she said. Elias touched his side. Pain reminded him he was still a man made of flesh. "It's nothing," he lied. Hattie didn't accept it. She reached for him with hands that had fixed wires and stitched disasters. She pulled his coat back and touched the wound carefully. Elias held still, letting her do it without protest. In that touch, the romance he'd been afraid to name earlier became undeniable. Hattie looked up at him. Her eyes were full of tired love, love that had survived the West's taste for endings. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Elias considered all the choices that had brought them here. The lies he'd told to keep people alive, the truths he'd translated slowly so they wouldn't ignite, the nights he'd spent alone above the saddlery. He considered the dead scout by the reeds and the way a life could end while a story continued. "No," he said softly. "Not anymore." Hattie's expression broke open with relief. She reached up and brushed her thumb across the scar on his cheek again, as if confirming it was real. "I regret the time I thought love had to wait until the world became safe," she admitted. "But maybe the West was never supposed to be safe. Maybe it was supposed to be honest about what we refused to sacrifice." Elias didn't have a clever reply. He only leaned closer and pressed his forehead to hers. He kissed her then, careful, reverent, not the hungry kiss of a man making up for lost chances, but the steady kiss of someone deciding that tenderness was not weakness. From the shadows near the doorway, Marrow stood silently. Elias felt him there like a boundary stone again, proof that love didn't always come with possession. Marrow wasn't jealous. He was simply watching the consequences of choices. After the kiss, Hattie exhaled and smiled a little through her tears. "It's too late for easy," she whispered. Elias nodded. "Good," he replied. "Then it's earned." Marrow approached them at last. "The border will still try to pull us apart," he said. Hattie looked at Marrow, and something in her face softened into gratitude and grief at once. "And if it does?" she asked. Marrow's eyes darkened with an old wisdom. "Then we choose each other with our eyes open." Elias took Hattie's hand. Her fingers fit his like they had been waiting for this shape all along. They planned for leaving together again, but this time it wasn't an escape from danger only. It was a decision to live beyond the border's lies. Two cultures still clashed. Two flags still flew. The West still kept offering endings like it was a habit. But in the space between those endings, Elias and Hattie found a beginning that didn't pretend the past could be erased. It only promised that love would not be the part of them the world could demand to die. And Marrow, who had seen too many good intentions get people buried, allowed himself one small hope. Not hope that the border would become kind. Hope that three imperfect people could become stubborn enough to keep choosing tenderness in a place built for breaking hearts.